Welcome back, everyone, to another Silicon Labs Talking Tech podcast. Today's topic, drive-by data collection from smart meters, is our monthly episode where we're going to focus again on security. We received so much positive feedback from our first episode where Josh and Arash talked about glitching attacks. The people that contacted us said that they learned a ton and they were excited for more episodes on security. Well, so here we are. We're back again. I'm joined by our security system engineer, Josh Norem. Thanks, Josh, for joining us again.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So it's always tough to follow up on the first episode when you set the bar so high. So are you ready to see if our listeners will appreciate this episode just as much?
Let's give it a shot. What's the worst that can happen?
That's true. Well, again, the whole purpose of our episodes on security is for you to help listeners better understand a specific security topic that's maybe in current events. I was recently reading an interesting article where someone locally in Dallas got a bunch of information from smart meters. They were able to use that information. They analyzed it, and they were able to find out who did and did not lose power during those recent ice storms in Texas. Is this something that we should all start worrying about? People being able to drive by our house and getting information from our utility meters?
Well, as with most things, the answer to that is a bit complicated. Security is always a system level problem. So the question as to whether we should worry about something or not depends a lot on the system. And I think in this case, at a first pass, there's maybe not a huge issue here. If you look at what happened, he was able to get information about how long the meter had been on, which let him know the last time it lost power, and also some GPS coordinates about where that meter was located. And in this case, that information was used to do some reporting, like you said, who lost power and when, and sort of evaluate the response to the power disruptions that we had. It's kind of tempting to look at that and say, oh, that's not too big a deal. But we do want to make sure we think critically. So for example, when I think about things like that, I don't think so much about directly using that information, leaking information about, where this meter exists when you're driving down the street very near it, and it's usually pretty obvious where meters are installed, isn't necessarily important. But then you get into things like phishing attacks. So for example, perhaps I'm going to use this information and I will know, I can gather information about when somebody's power comes back on and where they're at to get their address. And when somebody's power comes back on, I can send them a text message that says, hey, this is your power utility provider. We had a power outage and we just restored power. And if you can click this link and confirm that your power is back on, it will help us out. And of course, I provide a link to a site that looks like their provider, but in fact is trying to get their login credentials and things like that. Now, that example is a little bit contrived. There are probably many more efficient ways of doing phishing attacks, but it highlights how you have to think beyond the obvious and consider things like that. So in this case, the likelihood of that is fairly low, but in a very similar case, in a very similar system, there might be a piece of information where something like a phishing attack or something else actually would be important and does become a big problem. So you've got to look at the system and think about all of the things that could be done with any data that leaks.
Yeah, I've been getting so many phishing attacks lately, so I can only imagine. This is what you're saying is this is the perfect scenario to help those, because you have something where people automatically assume it's valid because it's right on top of power coming back on. So it can enable these phishing attacks to be more and more believable. So that's very difficult.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the keys in a good phishing attack is if you can provide information that seems like only an authorized person would have access to it, that lends a lot of credibility. So, if you know the time the power came back on or other details, it makes that harder. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what, Josh, what happened in this case? I mean, what was the mistake with these smart, so-called smart meters? I mean, what could have been done to prevent this?
Well, I think it's important to first keep in mind that metering systems have a long lifetime and have been around a long time. So it's very possible, and we of course have limited information, but it would not surprise me at all to learn that this protocol and these systems were developed back when, first of all, security wasn't their primary concern, and also possibly at a time when hardware capabilities were different and they had to work around some constraints that maybe don't exist today. So it's always useful to remember that security is evolving, and we don't want to look at it from in this case at least, we don't want to put on our mistake glasses and look at it that way. We want to look at it from an evolutionary point of view and what things can be done in the future to help prevent that. And in this case, we're lucky. This is very, very simple. They were sending data that was not encrypted. And it's no more complicated than that. Of course, the interesting thing here is some pieces of that data were useful, right? So if all they were sending was like network data that didn't really help anybody, that wouldn't have created this question. But when you have that intersection of some unencrypted and available data that is useful, then all of a sudden you have to start thinking about how that data could be used and could be used improperly. In this particular case, if you were designing a new system today, you would simply use encryption more prevalently and try to hide a little bit more of that data.
So why do you think they included the GPS and coordinates and all the other information about the meters, and they didn't even protect it? I mean, why do you think they would send that data at all in clear text?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we're making some guesses here, but if you look at the analysis that the researcher did and the information he located in that header, you can see, first of all, he points to a paper where the system developers were talking about routing, because this is a mesh network. So if I have 2 points that need to communicate, that data is going to hop from node to get across that mesh. And you can see where if you were building a mesh and figuring out your routes, where should I be sending data to get to a specific endpoint? Both GPS coordinates and uptime can be useful, right? If I have 2 different ways of getting to the endpoint I want, and on one of them, those systems has been up all of the time, and on the other one, the uptime is very low, I might prioritize the one that seems more stable. Same thing for GPS coordinates. If I know the physical layout, that gives me additional information to make good decisions in terms of the best way to route data around. And of course, when you're building that network, it's likely that, as nodes are joining and figuring out what the right way to route things are, they don't have network encryption keys or access to those things. So you would have that data in plain text so everybody can see it and agree on the right way of putting things together. So that's likely why they were doing what they were doing.
Okay, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, most networking algorithms that we've studied are all, on the transmission time and the packet loss, things like that. But having that GPS and that uptime data is just that other data that can help even strengthen their network more. So that's
Yep.
pretty cool way of using that information. Well, this question I have is kind of funny. I personally don't care when people find out when I'm running my washer and dryer or when my power cycles. But what other information do you think, what sensitive information could be available that maybe I'm not aware of and that I should be concerned about?
That's a great question. And the answer is we're not sure. Obviously, I am not the researcher and was not involved in building the product. Given my experience with similar systems and just knowledge of the space in general, I would suspect that most of the data payload is probably encrypted. This is probably not a completely open, completely unencrypted network. This is probably a network where the payloads are encrypted, but the routing data is not, and the routing data has included these metrics that we're talking about in it. This is somewhat supported if you look at sort of the analysis the researcher did. There's large chunks of this packet data that's just unknown packet data that he didn't know what it was doing. Pretty reasonable chance that's encrypted. So the good news is probably there's not a whole lot more here. In addition, the actual video and article that was written, that researcher intended to go look for places where data could be injected or other sort of similar things that might be more serious, either data breaches or methods of attack. And so far, we haven't seen anything in addition. So that sort of suggests that there's nothing at least obvious there. And there's a pretty reasonable chance that this particular instance is sort of confined to that GPS data and that uptime data. I suppose this is a good chance to throw out, one assumes that the manufacturers of these products and the people running the network have a product, security incident response process, and probably sat down and sort of did some evaluation to figure out whether there was work they needed to go do. That's something that everyone should do. But since nothing more has come out, at least for us as consumers, I wouldn't worry about it too much, right? As engineers, we want to keep it in mind when we're designing the next product or working on whatever it is we're working on. But as consumers at this point, I think that it's good knowledge to have, but not a reason to be very worried.
I guess it's good to hear about instances like this where a security attack is made aware, but it hasn't impacted anybody negatively, right? Because it brings more attention to the practices that you're trying to get other customers to look at. And without examples, and in this case, it wasn't that detrimental to people, it helps with the cause of adding more security. As you mentioned, adding teams that look at product security. If you don't have instances like this, people will just keep going and it won't be prioritized, it won't be funded, there won't be groups looking at it, right? So that's a nice thing about having cases like this pop up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also walks that line, because if you get a case that's a big, huge security breach that makes lots of news and causes lots of problems, that can have the opposite effect of not having any example at all, right? You can be not worried enough, but you can also be too worried at the same time. So this is a good way to, in problems like this are good for highlighting the needs and letting us grow as an industry without sort of provoking that overreaction and that sort of fear mentality that can also cause problems.
Well, one of my last questions is, you've talked to me about this before, and maybe it'd be good to share with our listeners what the best practices that companies can have when they're trying to assess this type of thing and assess the security of their product. Maybe you can just go through what a company should do when they have a situation like this, or to prevent a situation like this. What should the process be for this?
Yeah, and that's a good question. The simplest thing to do is start from a point of treating all information as confidential information by default, right? Design systems to disclose as little information as you can. Ultimately, that can also cause problems. Like you can run into a situation where it's more work to implement a new feature maybe, or to solve a functional problem. But given the choice between a problem that fails securely, and then we have to do a little more work to get what we want, versus a problem that fails insecurely, and all of a sudden we're dealing with a security incident in addition to what we need to fix, I would tend to tell people, to design things leaning a little bit more to the security side. And that doesn't mean you have to go overboard, and that you can't make rational decisions. But if you start by saying everything's confidential information, and then when you want to take something out of that sphere, making sure that you're comfortable with that decision, then you're not going to get caught by unexpected things later on, right? And you're going to fail safe. If it were me, I like to keep lists, right? So you can do something as simple as write down a list of information that each sort of privileged entity has access to. So what things can someone with a software-defined radio who's on the air, but nothing else, get access to? What can they see, right? What's my plain text? And then what about people who are on the network and have the network key? What information do they access? What about code on my, in this case, meter? What information does that have access to? And what information does my aggregator that's sitting on a pole somewhere have access to, right? You can just make a list of, for each actor in your system, what information do they have access to? And it makes it very easy to review and think about how important that information is, whether it really needs to be there or whether it can be more restricted, and understanding all of the data that's flowing in your system. And if people hear about threat modeling, that is one method of developing a threat model, right? What are the different contexts that people operate in, and what information do they have in each of those contexts? And for a threat model, what you will also typically do is say, okay, how hard is it for someone in one context to get access to information they're not supposed to have in another, right? And that's how you evaluate sort of your attack paths and resistance. And it all gets summed up under the major category of threat modeling. But even if it's just an Excel list of here's what people on air can access, here's what people with network key can access, here's what people writing code on the meter can access, that goes a long way to making sure that you're making informed decisions and you're not getting surprised by things.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I've always looked at it from a hardware point of view or a software point of view, and you're just looking at protocols and cryptography and how things are interconnected. But if you take it up a level and you're looking at the information and what is the information being encrypted and what is that information list, then you're looking at it a completely different way versus a hardware software engineer is going to be looking at it and not really looking at the threats that, who can access that information, what can they do if they have it, and what levels does it have to be secure from other people. So that's a great way to look at it. I mean, if you have more time, you want to talk about the threat model? That sounds like a great topic to cover.
That is a big topic, but maybe in another podcast further on down the road, we could dedicate some time to that.
All right, I guess you're right. Well, I still learned a lot. I think just looking at this case where a guy up in Dallas is able to get data off of smart meters, we learned a ton about what customers can do to really look at their products from a security standpoint, and it shows the public that we need to spend more time making sure that when we design products, we're looking at things not just, as I mentioned, from a hardware software, but from a security threat and from how they're protecting information. So thanks for taking the time to talk with us today, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we'll have you back on and we'll talk about more topics. Maybe we'll jump back into the threat model that you introduced here. Just for our listeners, we hope you learned more information on this second security podcast. We hope you found it was a quick way to better understand the growing importance of security in the world around us. And again, we know your time is valuable and we appreciate you taking the time to listen to our podcast series. So until next time, everyone, take care.